Winona's silk dress hung in tatters around her bleeding legs as she stumbled through the pine forest, her diamond earrings catching the last rays of dying sunlight. The spoiled Boston heiress who had never walked more than 3 blocks in her life was now crawling on her hands and knees, desperately searching for anything that looked like shelter. Her perfectly manicured fingernails were broken and caked with dirt, her golden ringlets matted with pine needles and tears. The emerald gown that had cost more than most families earned in 5 years was now just expensive rags clinging to her bruised and trembling body. Before we continue, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. 3 days ago, Winona had been sipping tea from fine china in her father's private train car, complaining that the cushions weren't soft enough for her delicate spine. The servants had rushed to adjust the pillows behind her back, their faces carefully blank as she criticized everything from the temperature of her bath water to the thread count of her bed linens. She had lived her entire 19 years believing that comfort was her birthright, that the world existed solely to cushion her from any hint of discomfort or inconvenience. Now she pressed her face against the rough bark of a towering pine tree, sobbing with the kind of desperation that only comes when death feels close enough to touch. Her throat burned from thirst, so intense it felt like swallowing broken glass. Her stomach cramped from hunger she had never known existed, a gnawing emptiness that made her dizzy and weak. The girl who had once sent back breakfast because the eggs weren't prepared to her exact specifications now would have eaten dirt if she thought it might ease the terrible ache in her belly. The Rocky Mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their peaks sharp as broken glass against the darkening sky. Each ridge looked exactly like the last, an endless maze of stone and pine that offered no landmark, no path, no hope of finding her way back to the world she understood. Somewhere in this wilderness, her father's expedition had continued without her, probably assuming she was dead already. The wagon carrying supplies had overturned during the storm, and in the chaos of screaming horses and flying debris, Winona had been thrown into a ravine like a discarded doll. When she finally climbed out, bruised and disoriented, the sounds of her rescue party had faded to nothing but whined through the trees. She had called until her voice was raw, screamed until her throat bled, but the forest swallowed her cries and gave nothing back but echoes. For the first time in her pampered life, no one was coming to save her. No servants to anticipate her needs, no father to solve her problems with money and influence, no cushion of wealth and privilege to protect her from the harsh realities of the world. She had always believed money could solve any problem, that her father's fortune had built walls around every hardship, every disappointment, every moment of genuine struggle. Her childhood had been a series of gilded cages, each more beautiful than the last. Private tutors who never dared to challenge her, servants who treated her every whim as sacred law, friends who sought her company only for the reflected glow of her family's wealth and status. But here in the mountains, with night falling like a black curtain and the temperature dropping with each passing minute, she realized how powerless she truly was. The wilderness didn't care about her family's railroad fortune or the bank accounts that stretched across 3 states. It didn't care about the diamonds at her throat or the silk dress that marked her as nobility among the merchant class of Boston. Here, she was just meat and bone and fear, no different from any other creature struggling to survive another night. Her feet, accustomed to nothing more challenging than Persian carpets and polished marble floors, were raw and bleeding inside her delicate silk slippers. The shoes had been designed for drawing rooms and ballrooms, not for scrambling over rocks and fallen logs. Each step sent bolts of pain up her legs, but she forced herself to keep moving because standing still meant accepting death. A wolf howled somewhere in the distance, long and mournful, followed by an answering call from another direction. Winona's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She had never heard that sound except in books, but something primal deep in her bones recognized the threat. Her legs shook as she pressed herself harder against the tree, trying to become invisible, trying to disappear entirely into the rough bark that scraped against her cheek. The expensive perfume that had once made gentlemen in Boston ballrooms lean closer now seemed like a beacon calling every predator in these mountains to find her. She could smell herself, a mixture of rosewater and terror that seemed to hang in the still air like a dinner bell for anything with teeth and claws. The scent that had once been her signature, imported from Paris at enormous expense, now felt like a death sentence written in fragrance. As darkness swallowed the forest completely, Winona closed her eyes and whispered a prayer to a god she had only acknowledged on Sundays when it was fashionable to be seen at church. Her religion had been as superficial as everything else in her life, another social ornament worn for appearance rather than conviction. But now, facing the vast indifference of the wilderness, she found herself pleading with whatever power might be listening to spare her life just one more day. She had no idea that 20 yards away, hidden in the shadows between two massive boulders, a pair of steel-gray eyes had been watching her stumble through the forest for the past hour. The mountain man stood silent as stone, debating whether this soft city girl deserved to survive what was coming next. He had seen her kind before, wealthy tourists who ventured into the wilderness with no understanding of its brutal honesty, its complete lack of mercy for the unprepared. Most of them died within days, victims of their own ignorance and the mountain's harsh justice. He usually let nature take its course, believing that the wilderness had a right to claim those who entered it without proper respect or preparation. But something about this girl's desperate fight for survival, her refusal to simply lie down and die despite being completely out of her element, stirred memories he had spent 15 years trying to bury. 2 weeks earlier, Winona had stood on the marble steps of her father's Boston mansion, watching servants load 17 trunks into the waiting carriages. Each trunk contained enough silk dresses, jewelry, and imported soaps to feed a frontier family for months. The morning sun gleamed off the brass fittings of the carriages, casting golden light across the perfectly manicured gardens that surrounded the Ashworth estate like a green fortress against the common world beyond. She had insisted on bringing her personal maid, her French tutor, and her collection of leather-bound poetry books because the idea of spending 6 weeks without proper culture seemed unbearable. The thought of existing in some primitive frontier settlement without daily instruction in literature and languages made her physically ill. How could she possibly maintain her refined sensibilities surrounded by crude miners and rough mountain folk who probably couldn't even read? "Father, surely we don't need to travel like common pioneers," Winona had complained, adjusting her emerald necklace in the reflection of the carriage window. The jewels caught the morning light and threw tiny rainbows across her porcelain skin, a skin that had never known the touch of actual sunlight without the protection of parasols and wide-brimmed hats. Her voice carried that particular tone of someone who had never been told no, sweet, but with steel underneath, honey over iron. Thaddeus Ashworth, railroad tycoon and one of Boston's wealthiest men, had built his empire by saying yes to his daughter's every whim. She was his only child, born after his wife died in childbirth, and he had spent 19 years trying to fill the hole in both their hearts with luxury and indulgence. Every room in their mansion was a shrine to her comfort, every servant trained to anticipate her needs before she even voiced them. "The rails only go so far west, darling," Thaddeus replied, lighting his expensive cigar with hands that had never known calluses. The tobacco was imported from Cuba, rolled by master craftsmen who charged more for a single cigar than most men earned in a week. "But this mining venture in Colorado will triple our fortune. Think of it as an adventure." He had no idea how prophetic those words would become, how completely they would transform his precious daughter's understanding of what adventure actually meant. The silver mines his business partners promised would make him even richer than his railroad fortune, but the journey through the Rocky Mountains was the price of that wealth. Maps spread across his mahogany desk showed veins of silver running through the Colorado mountains like rivers of liquid moonlight. His partners spoke of fortunes that would make the railroad money look like pocket change, enough wealth to establish the Ashworth name among the true American aristocracy. Winona had rolled her eyes and climbed into the cushioned interior of their private train car, immediately ringing for champagne to wash away the dust of travel she hadn't even encountered yet. The car was a masterpiece of luxury, fitted with crystal chandeliers that tinkled musically with each movement of the train, velvet curtains that blocked out any unpleasant sights, and a bed so soft it felt like sleeping on a cloud made of silk and down feathers. The world outside her window was just scenery, something pretty to glance at between novels and afternoon naps. She had spent 19 years believing that comfort was her birthright, that hardship was something that happened to other people, poor people, people who didn't matter in the grand scheme of civilized society. The passing landscape was like a painting in a museum, beautiful but distant, something to be observed rather than experienced. The train had carried them west for days, through cities that grew smaller and wilder with each mile. Chicago had been acceptable, still civilized enough to offer proper restaurants and decent hotels. But as they traveled further west, the settlements became rougher, more primitive, filled with men who stank of sweat and leather and dreams of gold that would probably never materialize. When they finally reached the end of the rail line in Denver, Winona stared in horror at the rough wooden buildings and muddy streets. "This can't be civilization," she whispered to her maid, pressing a silk handkerchief to her nose. The smell of horses, unwashed bodies, and wood smoke offended her delicate senses, which had been trained on rose gardens and French perfumes since childhood. The streets were rivers of mud mixed with horse droppings and garbage, nothing like the clean cobblestones of Boston, where servants swept and scrubbed until every surface gleamed. Men in dirty clothes spat tobacco juice into the street and spoke in accents she could barely understand. Women wore rough wool dresses instead of silk, their hands stained with work and their faces weathered by sun and wind. But the real shock came when she saw their transportation for the final leg of the journey. Instead of elegant carriages, a convoy of covered wagons waited in the dusty street like prehistoric beasts. Rough men in leather and wool checked supplies and harnessed horses that looked nothing like the gentle mares she rode for pleasure back home. These animals were scarred and wild-eyed, built for survival rather than show, their coats marked with the evidence of hard living and harder choices. "I won't travel in those horrible things," Winona announced, her voice rising with panic that made several passers-by turn to stare. "They're filthy and crude and completely unsuitable for a lady of breeding." But her father's business associates were already loading her trunks, their faces grim with the knowledge that mountain weather was turning dangerous. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon like dark promises, and experienced frontiersmen knew better than to delay when nature itself was issuing warnings. The wagon master, a grizzled man named Jack Morrison whose face looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains themselves, spat tobacco juice into the dirt and fixed Winona with eyes that held no sympathy. "Miss, these wagons have carried folks across 1,000 miles of wilderness. They ain't pretty, but they get the job done. You can ride in comfort or you can walk, but we're leaving in an hour either way." That first night camping under the stars, Winona lay awake on her narrow cot, listening to sounds she had never heard before. Coyotes yipping in the distance like demons celebrating some unholy feast. Wind howling through pine branches with voices that seemed almost human in their loneliness. The crackle of the campfire that was the only thing standing between her and the endless darkness of the wilderness that stretched beyond the circle of flickering light. For the first time in her pampered life, she felt truly afraid. Not the mild anxiety she experienced when a servant was slow to answer her bell, or the brief discomfort when her morning chocolate was served at the wrong temperature. This was primal terror, the kind that reached back to humanity's earliest memories of hiding from predators in caves and hoping to see another sunrise. She had no way of knowing that in 3 days, she would lose everything that made her feel safe, everything that defined her identity as Winona Ashworth, heiress to the railroad fortune and princess of Boston society. The girl sleeping fitfully on that camp cot had no idea that she was about to die, and that someone completely different would be born from her ashes. The storm hit on the third day like the wrath of an angry god, turning the sky black as midnight, even though it was barely past noon. Winona had been complaining about the uncomfortable wagon seat, demanding that her father do something about the rough wooden planks that bruised her delicate spine with every bump and jolt. She had been cataloging her grievances for the past hour, from the dust that settled on her silk dress to the crude language of the wagon drivers, when the first lightning bolt split the sky in half. The thunder that followed shook the ground beneath them with such violence that the horses reared in terror, their eyes rolling white with panic. Rain didn't fall, it attacked, turning the mountain trail into a river of mud and rocks that sent their wagon sliding sideways toward a cliff edge that dropped into nothing but shadows and death. The canvas cover of their wagon whipped and snapped in the wind like the wings of some monstrous bird trying to tear itself free. "Hold on," shouted their guide. But his words were swallowed by the screaming wind that seemed to have voices of its own, howling like all the demons of hell had been released at once. The horses bucked and fought against their harnesses, their hooves slipping on the treacherous footing as hailstones the size of chicken eggs hammered down on everything. Ice pellets struck the wooden wagon with sounds like gunshots, each impact threatening to shatter the fragile barrier between the passengers and the storm's full fury. Winona grabbed for anything solid, her fingers slipping on the wet canvas as the wagon tilted at an impossible angle. Through the chaos, she heard her father yelling her name, but the sound seemed to come from a different world, distant and fading as if he were calling to her from across an ocean of violence and noise. Her maid screamed once, a sound that was cut short as she was thrown against the wagon's side with bone-crushing force. The landscape around them had transformed into something from a nightmare. Pine trees bent nearly horizontal in the wind, their branches whipping like green whips that could flay skin from bone. Rocks the size of dinner plates tumbled down the mountainsides, bouncing and rolling with deadly momentum. The very earth seemed to be coming apart, as if the mountains themselves were trying to shake off these tiny human intruders who dared to cross their domain. Jack Morrison, the wagon master who had seemed so confident just hours before, fought to control the team of horses with muscles straining and sweat streaming down his weathered face despite the cold rain. His knuckles were white where they gripped the reins, and she could see the fear in his eyes as he realized that all his years of frontier experience might not be enough to save them from nature's fury. The wagon will hit a boulder and splintered like matchwood, the sound sharp and final as a death sentence. Time slowed as Winona felt herself flying through the air, her silk dress billowing around her like broken wings. She had a moment of perfect clarity where she could see the entire scene as if watching from above, her own body tumbling through space while her father reached desperately toward her, his face a mask of horror and helplessness. She hit the muddy slope and rolled, pine branches tearing at her face and hands as she tumbled down the mountainside like a broken doll. Rocks cut through her dress and into her skin, each impact sending jolts of pain through her body. The world spun in a blur of brown and green and red, mud and pine needles, and her own blood mixing together as she fell further and further from everything she had ever known. The ravine was deeper than it had looked from above, its walls steep and treacherous, covered with loose rock that shifted and slid at the slightest touch. She crashed into a fallen log at the bottom with enough force to drive the air from her lungs, leaving her gasping and broken in a tangle of torn silk and bleeding flesh. For several minutes, she could do nothing but lie there, stunned and disoriented, while the storm raged overhead like the end of the world. When she finally opened her eyes, everything was silent except for the steady drip of water from pine needles above her head. The storm had passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a world that looked like it had been torn apart and hastily reassembled by careless hands. Her body felt like it had been broken and put back together wrong, every joint aching, every muscle screaming in protest. Blood trickled from cuts on her arms and face, mixing with the mud that covered her from head to toe. The beautiful emerald dress that had cost more than most people earned in a year was now just rags hanging from her bruised body, the silk torn and stained beyond any hope of repair. Her jewelry was gone, probably scattered across the mountainside like glittering breadcrumbs that would never lead her home. "Father," she called out, her voice cracking with fear and pain that went deeper than physical injury. Only her echo answered back from the rocky walls of the ravine, a hollow mockery of her desperation. She tried to climb up the steep slope, but her hands couldn't find purchase on the wet rocks and loose dirt. Every few feet, she slipped back down, scraping her knees and palms raw against the unforgiving stone. The silk shoes that had been perfect for Boston drawing rooms were useless here, their thin soles offering no grip on the treacherous terrain. They fell apart within minutes, leaving her feet bare and bleeding as she struggled against the ravine walls that seemed designed to trap anything that fell into their embrace. The mountain had swallowed her as completely as if she had never existed. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time had no meaning in this green prison of towering trees and shadowy crevices where sunlight barely penetrated. Winona's throat burned with thirst, and her stomach cramped from hunger she had never experienced. When she found a small pool of rainwater collected in a rock depression, she drank desperately, not caring that it tasted of dirt and pine needles and things she didn't want to identify. The girl who had once sent back soup because it wasn't the perfect temperature now gulped muddy water like it was the finest wine. Each swallow was a victory against death, a small rebellion against the wilderness that seemed determined to claim her bones for its collection. She had never imagined that water could taste so precious, that the simple act of drinking could bring such desperate gratitude. As the sun set on her second day in the ravine, painting the sky above in shades of red that reminded her of blood and fire, Winona finally understood what her father had meant by adventure. This wasn't some romantic story from her leather-bound books, where beautiful heroines faced picturesque dangers and were rescued by handsome heroes. This was real, and it was trying to kill her with the patient persistence of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. She pressed her face against the cold stone and cried until she had no tears left, her sobs echoing off the walls like the ghost of the pampered girl she used to be. Each echo seemed to mock her former life, her complaints about thread counts and water temperature now seeming so trivial they belonged to a different species entirely. Above her, hidden among the rocks and shadows where not even her desperate eyes could find him, Cassidy watched this broken creature struggle against the wilderness that had been his home for 15 years. The mountain man had survived blizzards that lasted for weeks, fought off bears with nothing but a knife, and lived through winters that would have killed a dozen city folk. He should have walked away and let nature take its course, as he had done so many times before. But something about the girl's desperate fight for life, her refusal to simply curl up and die despite being completely out of her element, stirred a memory he had tried to bury for years. A memory of another broken soul who had needed help, and the consequences of both giving it and withholding it. Cassidy had been 12 years old when his own family's wagon train was attacked by raiders near the Colorado border, a memory that lived in his bones like winter cold that never fully went away. He could still remember his mother's scream as she shoved him into a hiding spot beneath their overturned wagon, her last words echoing in his mind like a prayer that had never been answered. "Stay hidden, boy. No matter what you hear, don't come out until the sun rises twice." He had listened to his parents die while he cowered like a rabbit, too terrified to help, too young to fight, too small to make any difference against the men who laughed as they burned everything his family had built. The sounds had lasted forever and no time at all, screams and gunshots and the crackle of flames consuming the only home he had ever known. When he finally emerged 2 days later, buzzards were already picking at what remained of his world. For 15 years, he had lived alone in these mountains, avoiding every human contact, building walls of anger and solitude around the boy who had failed to save his family. He trusted no one, needed no one, wanted no one in his life. The wilderness had become his church, his teacher, his only friend. Every sunrise brought another day of blessed isolation from the world that had stolen everything he loved and left him with nothing but guilt and the endless echo of his mother's final scream. The mountain man who emerged from that tragedy was harder than granite and twice as cold. He had learned to read weather patterns like other men read books, to track animals through snow so deep it would bury a horse, to survive on roots and berries when game was scarce. His hands could start a fire in driving rain, build shelter from nothing but pine boughs and determination, or kill a man with nothing more than a sharp rock and the will to use it. Now this broken city girl was forcing him to remember things he had spent decades trying to forget. He watched her stumble through the forest below, her torn dress catching on every branch, her soft hands leaving bloody prints on the rocks she used to pull herself forward. She moved like a newborn deer, all shaking legs and desperate energy, completely helpless but somehow still fighting against odds that would have killed most grown men. From his hidden perch among the boulders, Cassidy could see everything that threatened her survival. The way she favored her left ankle told him she had twisted it badly during the fall. The cuts on her arms were already showing signs of infection, angry red lines spreading from wounds that needed cleaning and proper bandaging. Most dangerous of all was her complete ignorance of the wilderness that surrounded her. She had no idea that the berries she was eyeing hungrily would cause violent sickness that could kill her within hours. She didn't know that the clear stream she was approaching was contaminated with runoff from an old mining operation upstream, water that looked pure but carried death in every drop. She couldn't read the signs that told him a mountain lion had marked this territory just hours before, or recognize the tracks that showed a hungry bear had been foraging in this exact spot the night before. The smart thing would be to leave her. The mountains had their own justice, and pampered rich girls who wandered into the wilderness usually didn't survive their first week. He had seen it before with foolish prospectors and city folk chasing dreams of gold, their bodies becoming part of the forest floor when winter came early or storms caught them unprepared. Nature didn't care about your money or your bloodline or the tears you shed when reality finally broke through your comfortable illusions. But as Winona collapsed against a tree, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and cold that would only get worse as night approached, Cassidy saw something that surprised him. Instead of giving up, she tore a strip of fabric from her ruined dress and wrapped it around a deep cut on her palm. Her movements were clumsy and painful, her fingers trembling so badly she could barely manage the simple task. But there was determination in the way she gritted her teeth and kept going. Most people would have curled up and waited to die by now. He had seen strong men break under less pressure than this sheltered girl was facing, had watched experienced frontiersmen give up hope when the mountains showed them their true power. But she kept moving, kept trying, kept fighting even when every rational part of her mind must have been screaming that the situation was hopeless. There was something in her desperate struggle that reminded him of a wolf pup he had once found, separated from its pack and slowly starving in the wilderness. He had told himself he was too hard to care about one small creature's suffering, but he had ended up feeding it scraps and teaching it to hunt until it was strong enough to survive on its own. That pup had grown into the fiercest wolf in the territory, a predator that feared nothing and bowed to no one. "Damn," he muttered under his breath, the first word he had spoken aloud in 3 months. His own voice sounded strange and rusty from disuse, like a tool that had been left in the weather too long. He shifted his weight among the rocks, considering his options while part of his mind cataloged all the reasons why getting involved was a mistake that could cost him everything he had built in these mountains. The girl would be dead by morning if the temperature kept dropping the way mountain weather promised it would. Wolves had been prowling this area for weeks, drawn by the scent of deer that came down from the high country to drink at the stream. She smelled like fresh blood and fear, a combination that would draw every predator within miles to investigate whether she was prey worth taking. Against every instinct screaming at him to walk away, against 15 years of hard-won wisdom about the dangers of human contact, Cassidy began picking his way down the slope toward her. His moccasins made no sound on the forest floor, and his buckskin clothes blended perfectly with the shadows between the trees. He could have been a ghost for all the noise he made, or perhaps the spirit of the mountain itself come down to judge whether this intruder deserved mercy or justice. Years of hunting had taught him to move like the wind itself, to step on rocks instead of earth, to avoid the dry branches that would snap and betray his presence to wary game. He was a creature of the wilderness now, as much a part of the forest as the trees that sheltered him or the streams that gave him water. Civilization was something that happened to other people, in places far from the clean honesty of mountains that killed you or let you live based on strength and skill rather than money and connections. Winona never heard him coming. One moment she was alone, pressing her bleeding hands against the rough bark of a pine tree while tears carved clean tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. And the next moment, a figure stepped out of the darkness like something from a fever dream. Tall and lean as a wolf, with steel-gray hair hanging to his shoulders and eyes that seemed to see straight through her soul to catalog every weakness, every failure, every moment of pampered softness that had brought her to this place of reckoning. His face was weathered and hard, carved by years of mountain storms and endless solitude into something that belonged more to the wilderness than to the civilized world she had always known. Scars marked his hands and arms, the kind that came from fighting to survive rather than the decorative wounds that Boston gentlemen sometimes acquired in their carefully orchestrated duels. This was a man who had been tested by forces that would have destroyed her former life without even noticing the damage they caused. She opened her mouth to scream, but only a broken whisper came out, her voice failing her just when she needed it most. "Please," she managed, not even sure what she was begging for. Help? Mercy? Or just a quick death instead of the slow starvation and exposure that awaited her in this green prison where every shadow held threats she couldn't even imagine? Cassidy studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable as granite that had been shaped by a million years of wind and weather. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough as gravel and twice as cold, carrying the weight of all the years he had spent learning that mercy was often the cruelest gift you could give to something too weak to survive on its own. "You're going to die out here, city girl. Question is whether you want to learn how to live first." The mountain man's cabin was nothing like the grand houses Winona had known, built from rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud that had been mixed with pine needles and animal hair to keep out the killing cold of mountain winters. It crouched against the mountainside like a sleeping bear, so perfectly camouflaged that she might have walked past it a dozen times without seeing it. The structure seemed to grow from the rock itself, as if the mountain had decided to offer shelter to something it deemed worthy of survival. Inside, everything served a purpose with the brutal efficiency of a place where wasted space could mean death when storms trapped you for weeks at a time. Animal skins covered the walls for warmth, each one a trophy from a hunt that had meant the difference between eating and starving. Dried meat hung from the rafters like macabre decorations, strips of venison and elk that would sustain life when fresh game was impossible to find. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows that made the small space feel alive with hidden movements and ancient spirits. Tools lined the walls with military precision, every knife and axe and coil of rope placed exactly where it could be found in complete darkness. This was the home of a man who understood that survival depended on preparation, that comfort was a luxury that could kill you if you let it make you soft. The furniture was handmade and practical, built to last through decades of mountain weather and the kind of use that would have destroyed the delicate pieces that filled her father's mansion. Cassidy dropped her onto a pile of furs near the fire without ceremony, his movements economical and completely lacking in the courtly manners she had expected from every man she had ever met. "Name's Cassidy," he said, already turning away to tend the flames with practiced efficiency. "You got 3 minutes to tell me why I shouldn't throw you back to the wolves." His words hit her like slaps, but Winona was too exhausted to feel insulted by this breach of proper etiquette. The warmth from the fire was the first comfort she had felt in days, seeping into her bones like a promise that death might not claim her tonight after all. "I'm Winona Ashworth," she whispered, expecting the name to mean something, to carry the weight it held in every drawing room and business office from Boston to New York. In the civilized world, mentioning her father's railroad fortune opened doors and softened voices, made hard men suddenly eager to please, and proud women invite her to their most exclusive gatherings. The Ashworth name was currency more valuable than gold, a key that unlocked every door worth opening. Here, Cassidy just stared at her with those cold gray eyes, waiting for something that actually mattered in this place where names and bloodlines carried no more weight than the wind through the pines. His expression didn't change, didn't show even a flicker of recognition or respect for the fortune that had shaped her entire world. To him, she was just another piece of soft civilization that had wandered into the wilderness and found itself completely out of its depth. My father owns the Boston and Western Railroad, she continued desperately, her voice gaining strength as she fell back on the only power she had ever known. He'll pay any amount for my safe return. $10,000, 20,000, whatever you ask. Name your price, and he'll pay it without question. The numbers that would have bought mansions and luxury beyond imagining seemed to echo hollowly in this cabin where wealth meant nothing and survival was the only currency that mattered. Cassidy snorted, a sound that held no humor and even less patience for the kind of thinking that had gotten her into this mess. Money don't spend up here, girl. Can you start a fire without matches? Can you skin a rabbit? Can you find water when the streams run dry? Each question felt like a judgment, a test she was failing before the words even left his mouth. She had never even lit a candle without a servant's help, had never touched raw meat, had never gone more than a few hours without someone bringing her fresh water in crystal glasses. Can you track a deer through snow? He continued relentlessly. Can you tell which plants will feed you and which ones will kill you? Can you fight off a wolf with nothing but your bare hands? The questions came like hammer blows, each one revealing another layer of her complete helplessness in this environment where her education in French poetry and proper table manners counted for absolutely nothing. I don't understand, she said, her voice breaking as the full weight of her situation began to settle on her like a physical burden. I just need you to help me get back to civilization, back to my father and my real life. The words sounded pathetic even to her own ears, the plea of someone who still believed that problems could be solved by throwing money at them until they went away. The word civilization seemed to anger something deep inside Cassidy, touching a nerve that ran all the way back to the day he had lost everything that mattered to him. His jaw tightened, and he turned away from her completely, his shoulders rigid with old pain that had never properly healed. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of experiences that had carved deep scars on his soul. Civilization, he repeated, spitting the word like poison that had been festering in his mouth for years. You mean the place where men kill each other for gold? Where they break promises and leave children to die in the wilderness? Where they take everything that matters and burn it down just because they can? His voice carried old pain, wounds that had been given time to scab over but never truly heal. Your civilization tried to kill me once, he said quietly, his words carrying more menace than any shout could have managed. Took my family, burned my home, left me with nothing but hate and the will to survive. I ain't in a hurry to go back to that kind of mercy. The bitterness in his voice was like acid, eating away at any illusions she might have had about the world beyond these mountains. Over the next 3 days, Cassidy made it clear that saving her life came with a price that couldn't be paid in dollars or railroad stock. If she wanted to survive long enough to see her precious Boston again, she would have to earn every breath, every meal, every moment of warmth with skills she had never imagined needing. The lessons began before dawn and didn't end until she collapsed from exhaustion that went deeper than anything she had ever experienced. Her first task was building a fire, something she had watched servants do 1,000 times but never attempted herself. The process looked simple when others did it, just a matter of striking flint against steel until sparks caught in the waiting tinder. But watching and doing were separated by a gulf wider than the Atlantic Ocean, and her soft hands had no idea how to bridge that distance. Fire is life up here, Cassidy said, watching her fumble with flint and steel like a child trying to perform surgery with garden tools. No fire means no warmth, no cooked food, no way to signal for help if rescue comes looking. Get it wrong and you're dead. Simple as that. The flint felt impossibly heavy in her trembling fingers, and the steel seemed designed to slip away from her grip at the crucial moment. Her soft hands, which had never held anything rougher than silk embroidery or the leather binding of an expensive book, blistered and bled as she struck the flint again and again. Sparks flew in bright arcs that should have been beautiful but only served to mock her failures. Each attempt brought fresh pain to her already damaged palms, but no flame caught in the carefully prepared nest of tinder that Cassidy had provided. "I can't," she sobbed after her 20th failed attempt, her voice thick with tears of frustration and the growing certainty that she was going to die in this place because she couldn't master the most basic skill of survival. "My hands hurt so much, and I'm so tired I can barely think straight. Please, just show me how to do it properly." Cassidy's response was to kick dirt over her pathetic pile of tinder and walk away, leaving her alone with the cold ashes of her failure and the growing darkness that seemed to press against the cabin walls like a living thing with teeth and claws. "Then freeze," he said without looking back, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he had been commenting on the weather. "Makes no difference to me whether you live or die. Mountain don't care about your tears." Those words cut deeper than any physical pain she had endured, slicing through the last of her illusions about her own importance in the grand scheme of things. All her life, someone had rushed to solve her problems, to cushion her from every disappointment and shield her from every hint of genuine hardship. Servants had anticipated her needs before she even knew what she wanted. Her father had moved mountains of money and influence to ensure that his precious daughter never experienced a moment of real discomfort. Now she sat alone in the growing darkness, realizing that her survival depended entirely on her own two hands and whatever strength she could find buried beneath 19 years of pampered softness. The wilderness didn't care about her bloodline or her bank account or the tears that had always been enough to make strong men bend to her will. Here, crying was just another way to waste energy that might be needed for survival. Something shifted inside her chest as she sat there in the dark, something hot and fierce and completely unfamiliar. She had never felt rage like this before, pure and clean as mountain air, directed not at Cassidy or the mountains or even her father for bringing her to this place. The anger was aimed at herself, at the weak creature she had allowed herself to become, at 19 years of choosing comfort over strength and beauty over capability. Winona picked up the flint with shaking fingers and tried again, this time focusing not on her pain, but on the technique Cassidy had demonstrated with such casual expertise. This time, when the spark caught and tiny flames licked at the dry pine needles, she felt a victory sweeter than any triumph she had known in her pampered life. The fire grew under her careful breath, fed by her determination as much as by the tinder she added with trembling hands. But even as she basked in the warmth of her small success, she could see Cassidy watching from the shadows, his expression unreadable as he planned tomorrow's lesson. And she knew with absolute certainty that it would be 10 times harder than anything she had faced so far. 3 weeks into her training, Winona's hands looked like they belonged to a different person entirely, a creature forged by necessity rather than pampered by luxury. The soft white skin that had once been her pride was now covered with calluses and small scars from countless cuts and burns, each mark a testament to lessons learned through pain and repetition. Her fingernails, once perfectly manicured and painted with expensive lacquers imported from Paris, were broken and dirty from digging roots and splitting wood and handling the rough tools that had become extensions of her will to survive. The emerald dress that had survived the storm and the fall had finally given up its battle against the wilderness, falling apart piece by piece until nothing remained but memories of silk and vanity. In its place, she wore rough wool pants and a leather shirt that Cassidy had grudgingly provided after her original clothing became more liability than protection. The new garments were practical and warm, designed for movement and durability rather than beauty, and they fit her transformed body like armor made from the mountain's own materials. Every morning brought new challenges that would have seemed impossible just weeks before, tasks that pushed her beyond the comfortable boundaries of her former life into territory where failure meant death and success meant earning another day of existence. Her muscles, once soft from a lifetime of leisure, had hardened into functional tools capable of swinging an axe for hours or hauling water from distant streams without complaint. "Today you learn to hunt," Cassidy announced on a crisp morning when frost painted the pine needles silver and her breath formed clouds in the thin mountain air. He handed her a crude bow made from mountain ash, its surface scarred by years of use, but still flexible and strong. The weapon felt impossibly heavy in her arms, the weight of responsibility as much as wood and sinew pressing down on her shoulders. When she tried to draw the string, her muscles screamed in protest despite all the physical work she had been doing. The bow required a different kind of strength, one that came from the deep core muscles she had never properly developed during her years of drawing room entertainment and gentle horseback rides through Boston's tame parks. "See that rabbit by the creek?" Cassidy continued, his voice matter-of-fact as if he had asked her to arrange flowers instead of take a life. "Kill it, or we don't eat tonight." Winona stared at the small brown creature nibbling grass 30 yards away, its fur gleaming in the morning sunlight like spun gold. It looked so innocent, so peaceful in its simple pursuit of breakfast, completely unaware that death was watching it through human eyes. The idea of killing it made her stomach turn with the same revulsion she had once felt watching the cook prepare chicken in the kitchen of her father's mansion. Except now there was no way to simply leave the room and pretend the ugly realities of life didn't exist. Back in Boston, her meals had arrived on silver platters, already cooked and beautifully arranged by skilled chefs who transformed the brutal necessity of killing into elegant presentations that bore no resemblance to the animals they had once been. She had never connected the roast beef on her dinner table with the gentle cows that grazed in the countryside, had never imagined that her survival might depend on her willingness to look death in the eye and choose to be the one who dealt it rather than received it. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the creek bubbling over smooth stones. "It's just a harmless little animal living its life. How can I just murder it for no reason?" The words sounded hollow even to her own ears, the protest of someone who still believed that meat appeared magically on plates without any connection to the messy realities of survival. "Harmless little animal will keep you alive when winter comes," Cassidy said, his voice hard as flint and twice as unforgiving. "Up here, everything eats or gets eaten, everything kills or gets killed. Choice is whether you want to be the hunter or the meat." He stepped behind her, his calloused hands covering hers on the bow with a gentleness that surprised her after weeks of his harsh instruction. "Feel the string against your cheek," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear as he guided her into the proper stance. "Breathe slow and steady, don't rush the shot. When you let go, follow through like you mean it, like your life depends on making this arrow fly true." His hands were steady and sure, guiding her trembling fingers into position with the patience of someone who understood that this moment was about more than just killing a rabbit. The first arrow sailed wide, striking a tree trunk with a dull thud that sent the rabbit hopping a few feet away before it settled back into its breakfast as if nothing had happened. The sound of her failure seemed to echo through the forest, announcing to every creature within miles that a predator had tried and missed, that the natural order remained intact for now. Winona's second shot hit the ground 3 feet short, the arrow disappearing into the thick grass like her confidence was disappearing into doubt and self-recrimination. Her third arrow vanished completely into the thick brush beyond the creek, lost among the shadows and undergrowth where she would never find it again. Each failure felt like a judgment, proof that she was still too soft, too civilized, too removed from the harsh realities that governed life in the wilderness. "Again," Cassidy said, retrieving arrows with the patience of stone and the persistence of water wearing away mountains. And again until you get it right, or until you starve trying." For 2 hours, Winona shot at that rabbit and missed every time, her shoulders aching from the unfamiliar strain of drawing the bowstring, her fingers raw from the rough hemp that abraded her skin with every attempt. Her tears of frustration ran down her dirt-streaked cheeks as she fought against the growing certainty that she would never master this skill, that she was fundamentally too weak and too sheltered to become the kind of person who could survive in this place, where mercy was a luxury that could get you killed. The rabbit seemed to mock her with its casual indifference to her efforts, continuing to graze peacefully while she struggled with the weight of mortality and necessity. Just as she was about to give up, to admit defeat and accept whatever consequences Cassidy deemed appropriate for her failure, the rabbit made a fatal mistake. It hopped directly into her line of sight, close enough that even her trembling hands couldn't miss, positioned perfectly in that sweet spot where her amateur archery skills intersected with pure blind luck. The arrow flew true for the first time, striking the small creature through the heart with a sound like a whispered prayer answered by sudden silence. The rabbit dropped without a sound, its peaceful expression unchanged even in death, as if it had simply decided to take a nap in the morning sun. For a moment, the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging the passage of one small life into whatever came after. Winona stared at what she had done, the bough falling from nerveless fingers as the full weight of the moment settled on her like a physical thing. The girl who had once fainted at the sight of blood during a cousin's nosebleed had just killed her first living creature, had crossed a line that separated the civilized world from the brutal honesty of survival. The weight of that crossing was heavier than she had expected, a burden that changed something fundamental in the way she saw herself and her place in the natural order. "Good," Cassidy said, walking over to collect the rabbit with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he brought to every task. "Now you skin it and cook it. Every part gets used up here. Meat for food, hide for clothes, bones for tools. Nothing gets wasted in the mountains because waste is just another word for death." He handed her a sharp knife, its blade gleaming in the afternoon sun like a mirror that reflected her new reality back at her. As Winona knelt beside the dead rabbit, her hands shaking as she made the first cut through fur and skin that had been warm with life just moments before, something fundamental changed inside her. The squeamish rich girl who had turned away from unpleasant sights was dying just as surely as the animal at her feet, becoming something harder and more honest about the true cost of survival. The process was messier and more difficult than she had imagined, her inexperienced hands struggling with the delicate work of separating skin from flesh without damaging either. Blood stained her fingers and soaked into the earth beneath her knees, marking this place as the spot where Winona Ashworth had finally learned that life required death, that comfort required sacrifice, that strength could only be built on a foundation of hard choices and harder truths. That night, as she ate the rabbit she had killed and prepared with her own hands, the meat tasted different than any meal she had ever known. It tasted like survival earned rather than purchased. It tasted like strength pulled from her own depths rather than borrowed from her father's wealth. It tasted like the first real food she had ever earned in her 19 years of privileged existence. And despite everything, it was the most satisfying meal of her life. But even as she savored this small victory, Cassidy watched her eat with eyes that held no approval, only calculation and the kind of assessment that came from years of judging whether something had what it took to survive the tests that were yet to come. Tomorrow's lesson would reveal whether she had truly begun to change, or if she was still just a soft city girl playing at being wild, while the real wilderness waited patiently for her to fail when the stakes became life and death. The howling started just after midnight, a sound that cut through the mountain silence like a blade through silk. Winona jolted awake on her bed of furs, her heart hammering against her ribs as the eerie calls echoed off the canyon walls. She had heard wolves before during her weeks in the mountains, but this was different. This was closer. This was hunting music. "Cassidy," she whispered, reaching toward where the mountain man usually slept near the door. Her fingers found only empty space and cold furs. He was gone, vanished as silently as morning mist. The cabin felt suddenly enormous and fragile, its log walls no thicker than paper against whatever was circling outside in the darkness. Through the single window, she caught glimpses of yellow eyes reflecting the dying firelight. Not one pair, but many, moving with the coordinated patience of pack hunters who knew their prey was trapped. The wolves had found their scent, followed it through miles of forest to this small sanctuary carved from the wilderness. A heavy thud against the cabin door made Winona scramble for the rifle Cassidy had taught her to use. Her hands were steady now, muscle memory taking over where terror once would have frozen her completely. The weapon felt solid and reassuring in her grip, but she knew she had only 6 shots. If there were more than 6 wolves, if she missed, if her nerve failed, she would die in this place far from everything she had once called home. The scratching started next, claws against wood as powerful bodies tested the strength of the door. Through gaps in the logs, she glimpsed massive shoulders and heads the size of boulders, muscles rippling beneath thick winter coats. The pack leader was larger than any dog she had ever seen, his intelligent yellow eyes studying the cabin like a general planning a siege. Where was Cassidy? Had he abandoned her to face this alone, or was he out there somewhere in the darkness? The mountain man moved through the forest like a ghost when he chose to, appearing and disappearing without sound or warning. Maybe he was circling behind the pack, or maybe he had finally decided that saving a pampered city girl wasn't worth the trouble. The door shuddered as the pack leader threw his weight against it. Ancient Wood groaned and bent, but the iron bar held firm. She could hear them communicating in low growls and whines, coordinating their attack with intelligence that made wolves so much more dangerous than simple beasts. They weren't just hungry. They were thinking. She moved to the window, rifle ready, and aimed at the largest shadow she could see. Her breathing was steady now, controlled, nothing like the panicked gasps that would have overwhelmed her 2 months ago. The soft Boston heiress would have fainted at the first sight of those yellow eyes. But that girl was gone, replaced by someone harder, someone who could pull a trigger when survival demanded it. The shot rang out like thunder, and she heard a sharp yelp followed by the sound of a heavy body hitting the ground. One down. The pack scattered momentarily, startled by the noise and gunpowder smell, but they didn't retreat. If anything, the death of their companion seemed to make them more determined. The battle lasted until dawn, a deadly dance between predator and prey that transformed Winona into something she had never imagined possible. She moved through the cabin like a creature born for violence, reloading and firing with mechanical precision while the wolves tested every weakness in their wooden fortress. When her ammunition ran low, she grabbed the hunting knife Cassidy had given her, its blade sharp enough to shave with. The pack leader made his final assault just as the first rays of sunlight touched the mountain peaks. He came through the window in an explosion of glass and fur, his massive jaws snapping at her throat. But Winona was no longer the helpless girl who had stumbled through the forest months ago. She rolled aside and drove the knife deep between his ribs, feeling his hot blood spray across her face as his own momentum carried the blade home. As the great wolf collapsed, the rest of the pack melted away into the forest like smoke. They had lost their leader and 2 others to this strange prey that fought back with tooth and claw. In the sudden silence, Winona knelt beside the fallen alpha, her hand resting on his massive head. There was no triumph in the moment, only the quiet satisfaction of a survivor who had earned her place in the harsh mathematics of the wilderness. Well done. Cassidy's voice came from the doorway, startling her. He stepped over the broken glass, his eyes taking in the carnage with professional interest. "Where were you?" she asked, wiping wolf blood from her cheek. Her voice held no accusation, only curiosity. She understood now that survival was a personal responsibility. "Watching," he replied simply. "Had to know if you were ready." Ready for what? He didn't say, but something in his weathered face had changed. The cold calculation was still there, but beneath it, Winona glimpsed something that might have been respect. Over the following weeks, her training intensified beyond anything she could have imagined. Cassidy taught her to track deer through snow so deep it came up to her waist, to read the sky for weather changes that could kill the unprepared. She learned to move through the forest without disturbing a single leaf, to find shelter in places that looked barren to untrained eyes, to fight with knife and fist when ammunition ran out. Her body hardened like tempered steel. The soft curves of pampered femininity gave way to lean muscle and quick reflexes. Her hands, once smooth as silk, became as tough as leather from handling ropes and weapons and the sharp edges of survival. She could start a fire in driving rain, skin a deer in 10 minutes, and shoot the eye out of a squirrel at 50 yards. But the real change was deeper than physical transformation. The girl who had once burst into tears when her morning chocolate wasn't perfectly prepared now faced each dawn with the calm certainty of someone who had tested herself against death and won. She no longer flinched at the sight of blood or the sound of gunfire. Pain was just information now. Fear just another tool to keep her alive. One morning, as she practiced throwing her knife at a target carved into a pine tree, Cassidy watched her with those unreadable gray eyes. The blade struck dead center 3 times in a row, each throw precise and deadly. "You're not the same person who fell down that ravine," he observed quietly. Winona turned to face him, the knife balanced perfectly in her scarred hand. Her stance was that of a predator now, weight on the balls of her feet, ready to move in any direction. "No," she agreed, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had looked into the abyss and discovered she was stronger than the darkness staring back. "That girl died in the forest. I'm someone else now." The transformation was complete. Where once stood a pampered heiress who had never known hardship, now stood a woman forged by necessity into something the mountains themselves had shaped. Her eyes held depths that spoke of battles fought and won, of deaths dealt and survived, of a will that had been tested against the wilderness and emerged unbroken. Cassidy nodded slowly, something like pride flickering in his weathered features. For weeks, he had pushed her beyond every limit, broken down every soft assumption about life and comfort and safety. He had watched her cry, rage, despair, and finally accept the brutal honesty of survival. She had earned her place in this harsh world through blood and determination. "Winter's coming early this year," he said, studying the sky where clouds gathered like gray promises of snow and cold that would test everything she had learned. "You'll need every skill I've taught you, and some I haven't had time for." His voice carried a weight that made her look at him sharply. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked, reading the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept scanning the forest as if expecting trouble. Weeks of learning to read the wilderness had also taught her to read the man who had become her unlikely teacher. Before he could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the valley, growing louder with each passing moment. Cassidy's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, his body coiling with the readiness of a predator sensing danger. Winona felt her own muscles tense, every nerve alert as riders appeared through the morning mist. 5 men in dark coats, their faces grim beneath wide-brimmed hats, riding with the purposeful determination of bounty hunters who had finally found their quarry. They moved with the confidence of professionals, men who killed for money and had come for the girl who no longer existed. "Miss Winona Ashworth," the lead rider called out as they reined in their horses 20 yards from the cabin. He was a lean man with cold eyes and a voice like grinding stone. "Your father has been very worried about you. He sent us to bring you home safe and sound." Winona stepped out from behind the cabin, and the bounty hunter's expressions shifted from confidence to confusion. The girl they had expected to find was a pampered heiress in silk and jewels, helpless and grateful for rescue. What they saw instead was a lean wolf in human form, dressed in buckskin and leather, with eyes that held no fear and hands that rested comfortably near the weapons at her belt. The mountain had claimed her completely, transformed her from prey into predator. The soft civilization these men represented felt as foreign to her now as the wilderness once had. She belonged here, in this place where strength mattered more than bloodlines and survival was the only currency that counted. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had faced down wolves and lived to tell about it. "This is my home now." The lead bounty hunter laughed, but there was uncertainty in the sound. His orders had been simple: find the spoiled rich girl and drag her back to Boston. No one had warned him that she might not want to be found, or that she might have become something dangerous in the process. Miss, your father is offering a substantial reward for your safe return. He tried again, dismounting with careful movements. $10,000 to any man who brings you home. That's enough money to set a fellow up for life. His hand drifted toward the gun at his hip, a gesture meant to look casual but fooling no one. My father's money doesn't spend here, Winona replied, echoing words Cassidy had spoken to her months ago. And I'm not his property to be bought and sold. The transformation was complete now. The pampered heiress who had once lived for her father's approval was gone forever, replaced by a woman who bowed to no one. The other bounty hunters spread out in a practiced formation, their hands hovering near their weapons. They had done this before, cornered desperate people who thought they could escape their past. But they had never faced someone who had been forged by the wilderness itself, tempered by hardship into something harder than they could imagine. Now don't make this difficult, miss, the leader said, his patience wearing thin. We can do this easy or we can do this hard, but you're coming with us either way. Your daddy's worried sick, and he just wants his little girl back home where she belongs. The word belongs triggered something primal in Winona's chest. She had spent her entire life being told where she belonged, what she should want, who she should become. The mountains had taught her that she belonged to no one but herself, that freedom was something you had to fight for and keep fighting for every day. The negotiation ended when the bounty hunter's patience ran out. His hand moved for his gun, but Winona was faster. The knife left her fingers like a striking snake, burying itself in his shoulder before he could clear leather. He screamed and stumbled backward, clutching at the blade that had appeared as if by magic. Jesus Christ, one of the other men shouted, going for his weapon. But Cassidy was already moving from his position near the cabin. His rifle barked once, twice, 3 times, and 2 men toppled from their saddles to lie still in the mountain dirt. The remaining bounty hunters wheeled their mounts around and fled back down the trail, abandoning their wounded leader and their dead companions to the mercy of the mountains. Winona walked over to the wounded man, pulling her knife free with a quick, merciless jerk that brought fresh screams. She cleaned the blood from the blade on his coat with the same casual efficiency Cassidy had taught her for cleaning game. The sight of blood no longer made her sick. Violence was just another tool now, to be used when necessary and put away when the job was done. You tell Thaddeus Ashworth that his daughter is dead, she said, kneeling beside him so he could see the wild light burning in her eyes. The girl he raised died in these mountains. What stands here now belongs to no one but herself. The wounded bounty hunter nodded frantically, eager to agree to anything that might spare his life. As he staggered toward his horse, bleeding and broken, Winona felt the last chains of her old life snap and fall away. She was free now, truly free, for the first time in her 19 years. But even as she watched him disappear into the forest, she knew this wouldn't be the end. Her father wouldn't give up easily. Men like Thaddeus Ashworth didn't accept defeat gracefully, especially when it came to things they considered their property. He would send more men, better men, men who wouldn't underestimate what she had become. They'll be back, Cassidy said quietly, reading her thoughts. Your father won't take no for an answer, not when it comes to his precious investment. Winona nodded, understanding the truth in his words. But she also understood something else, something that the old Winona never could have grasped. She was ready for whatever came next. The mountains had made her into a weapon, and she was finally ready to use that weapon to defend the life she had chosen. Let them come, she said, her voice carrying the cold certainty of winter wind through pine needles. I'm not the same girl they're looking for. That girl was weak. That girl was afraid. That girl needed other people to fight her battles. She looked at the blood on her hands, at the bodies of men who had tried to take her freedom, at the vast wilderness that had become her sanctuary and her strength. I'm something else now, something they won't see coming until it's too late. The mountain wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of harder tests to come. But Winona faced it without fear, because she had learned the most important lesson the wilderness could teach. Sometimes the only way to truly live was to be willing to die for what mattered most. Winter came early that year, blanketing the mountains in snow so deep it erased the world Winona had once known. She stood on the cabin porch, watching snowflakes dance in the firelight that spilled through the open door, and marveled at how completely she had been transformed. 6 months ago, she had been a helpless ornament in her father's mansion. Now she was something the mountains themselves had forged from necessity and survival. The wounded bounty hunter's message had reached Boston, she was certain. By now, her father knew that his precious daughter had chosen the wilderness over his fortune, freedom over the golden cage he had built around her life. There would be no more rescue attempts. Thaddeus Ashworth was a practical man, and he would cut his losses rather than throw good money after bad. In his ledgers, Winona was already dead. You ever regret it? Cassidy asked from the doorway, his voice rougher than usual in the cold air. He had been different since the bounty hunters came, more protective, more aware that their isolation was fragile and could be shattered by the outside world at any moment. Winona turned to face him, and in the flickering firelight, she looked like some ancient goddess of the hunt. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, no longer bound by silk ribbons and social expectations. Her clothes were simple buckskin and wool, but they fit her like armor. Most striking of all were her eyes, which now held depths that no pampered rich girl could ever possess. "Regret what?" she asked, genuine puzzlement in her voice. "Regret learning who I really am? Regret discovering that I'm stronger than I ever imagined? Regret finding out what it feels like to earn every breath, every meal, every moment of safety with my own 2 hands?" She shook her head, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The girl who lived in that mansion was never really alive. She was just existing, waiting for someone else to tell her what to want and who to be. Over the long winter months, Winona had become something unprecedented in these mountains. She was neither the soft civilization that Cassidy despised nor the untamed wilderness that most people feared. She was something entirely new, a bridge between two worlds that had seemed forever separate. She could track a deer through fresh snow and discuss philosophy with equal skill. She could fight like a wildcat and still appreciate the beauty of morning light on fresh powder. "I've been thinking," Cassidy said, his words forming white clouds in the frigid air. "Come spring, I might head down to the settlements. Been alone up here for 15 years. Maybe it's time to see if the world's changed any." He didn't say what they both knew, that her presence had changed him too, softened the edges of his bitter solitude without making him weak. "And I've been thinking I might stay," Winona replied, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had found their true home. "These mountains taught me everything worth knowing. They gave me a life worth living. Why would I want to go anywhere else?" She gestured toward the vast wilderness stretching endlessly in every direction, snow-covered peaks gleaming like silver crowns under the star-drunk sky. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, word filtered up from the settlements about strange tales being told in the taverns and trading posts. Stories of a mountain woman who could outshoot any man, outtrack any hunter, and who fought like a demon when cornered. Some called her a myth, others a cautionary tale, but those who had seen her knew the truth. Years later, when travelers asked about the legend of the woman who lived wild in the high country, the old-timers would shake their heads and smile. They would speak of a rich girl who went into the mountains and never came out, because what emerged was something altogether different. A warrior forged by necessity, tempered by hardship, and polished to a deadly shine by the kind of freedom that most people only dream about. On quiet nights when the wind was still and the stars hung close enough to touch, Winona would sometimes think about the girl she used to be. That frightened, helpless creature seemed like someone from a story now, a cautionary tale about what happened when you let other people define your worth and your possibilities. She felt no anger toward her former self, only a kind of distant pity for someone who had lived her entire life in a cage and called it luxury. The mountains had stripped away everything false about her, everything weak and dependent and afraid. What remained was pure and strong and entirely her own. She had paid for her freedom with blood and pain and the death of everything she thought she wanted. But the price had been worth it, because now she knew what it felt like to be truly alive. If you listened carefully to the wind in the pines on clear mountain nights, you might hear the echo of her laughter, wild and free and belonging to no one but the wilderness that had claimed her as its own. And if you were very lucky, you might catch a glimpse of her moving through the trees like a shadow with silver eyes, a legend made flesh who proved that sometimes the only way to find yourself is to lose everything else first. Thanks for staying with me through this incredible journey from pampered heiress to mountain warrior. If this story moved you, touched your heart, or made you believe in the power of transformation, please hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing tales that will inspire and captivate you. Every day, I bring you stories of ordinary people who discovered extraordinary strength within themselves. What story will we explore together tomorrow?